An original story, narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. The dining room falls silent as Viscount Crane leans back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips as he gestures toward the far end of the table, where Lydia Marsh sits with her teacup frozen, halfway to her mouth. The Duke of Wetherby, Adrian Wetherby, sets down his own cup with a precision that makes the silver ring against porcelain, his jaw tightening as every eye in the room turns to him, waiting. His voice, when it comes, is cold enough to frost the windows. She's nothing to me. Lydia's fingers tighten imperceptibly around the delicate handle, her face a perfect mask of composure, even as something inside her shatters like glass. By evening, the same man who denied her will stand in the entrance hall, with dueling gloves in hand, his voice shaking with barely contained fury as he tells Crane, "You will meet me for what you said." And Lydia, watching from the shadows of the corridor, will finally understand that love is not always spoken in words of affection. Sometimes it is declared in the willingness to destroy oneself for another's honor. Miss Lydia Marsh arrived at Wetherby Hall on a gray afternoon in late October of 1828, when the trees had already surrendered most of their leaves to the wind, and the sky hung low and heavy over the Derbyshire countryside. She came in a hired coach that rattled up the long gravel drive, past the iron gates and the ancient oaks that lined the approach like sentinels. The house itself rose before her, all gray stone and tall windows, its facade austere and imposing in the fading light. She had seen grand houses before, but none quite like this, none that seemed to watch her with such quiet judgment. She was 27 years old, neither young nor old, neither beautiful nor plain. Her face was intelligent, her manner composed, her dress simple but well kept. She had been a governess for 6 years, moving from household to household as positions ended or circumstances changed. She had learned to read the subtle hierarchies of great houses, to navigate the invisible boundaries between family and staff, to make herself indispensable without ever forgetting her place. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, met her at the door. She was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back severely and a face that revealed nothing. "Miss Marsh, you are expected. The Duke is in London and will return tomorrow. You will meet Miss Catherine in the schoolroom after you have settled." Lydia followed her through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old wood, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her progress. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as though even the walls had learned discretion. Her room was small but adequate, tucked away in the east wing near the schoolroom. A narrow bed, a washstand, a writing desk by the window that looked out over the gardens. It was more than she had expected. It was also, she understood immediately, a reminder of her station. She unpacked her few belongings with methodical care. 3 dresses, a shawl, books, writing materials, the small painted miniature of her mother, long dead. When everything was in its place, she stood by the window and looked out at the formal gardens below, their paths precise and orderly even in autumn's decline. Somewhere in this house was a man she had never met, a man whose reputation had preceded him in the brief correspondence that had secured her position. Adrian Wetherby, 5th Duke of Wetherby, unmarried, 34 years old, known in London for his political acumen and his refusal to suffer fools, known in the county for his exacting standards and his distance from the usual social pleasantries of his class. She had been hired to educate his niece, Catherine, a girl of 11 whose parents had died in a carriage accident 2 years prior. The child was his ward now, his responsibility. The previous governess had left abruptly. No reason had been given in the letter that offered Lydia the position, but she had learned not to ask too many questions. Positions were difficult to secure. She would do her work well and hope that it would be enough. That evening, she met Catherine in the schoolroom. The girl was small for her age, dark-haired and solemn, with eyes that watched Lydia with a wariness that spoke of too much lost too young. They spoke quietly about lessons and routines. Catherine answered politely, but offered nothing more. Lydia did not press. Trust, she knew, could not be demanded. It had to be earned slowly, through consistency and care. Later, as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the house settle around her, Lydia thought about the precariousness of her position. She was educated enough to teach the children of the wealthy, but not wealthy enough to be considered their equal. She was respectable, but only so long as she remained invisible. One misstep, one whisper of impropriety, and she would be cast out without references, her future destroyed. She had seen it happen to other women. She would not let it happen to her. She did not yet know that the man who owned this house, who commanded its routines and its silences, would become the greatest danger to everything she had built. She did not know that his attention, when it finally turned to her, would be both a gift and a curse. She did not know that within a few short months, she would have to choose between invisibility and ruin, between safety and truth. But on that first night, she knew only that she had arrived, and that she would do whatever was necessary to stay. The Duke returned the following afternoon. Lydia did not see him arrive, but she felt the change in the house immediately. The servants moved with greater purpose. Mrs. Bellamy's expression grew even more severe. The air itself seemed to tighten, as though the house were holding its breath. She was in the schoolroom with Catherine when she heard his voice for the first time. It came from somewhere below, low and measured, giving instructions to someone she could not see. Catherine looked up from her slate, her small face brightening slightly. "Uncle Adrian is home," she said quietly. It was the first time Lydia had heard warmth in the child's voice. That evening, Lydia was summoned to the library. Mrs. Bellamy delivered the message with her usual lack of expression. "The Duke wishes to speak with you regarding Miss Catherine's progress. 7 o'clock. Do not be late." Lydia arrived precisely on time. The library was a large room lined with books from floor to ceiling, its furniture dark and heavy, a fire burning low in the grate. Adrian Wetherby stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the darkening gardens. He was tall, his posture straight, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it. He did not turn immediately when she entered. "Miss Marsh." His voice was, as she remembered it from the corridor, low, controlled, without warmth, but also without cruelty. "Please sit." She sat in the chair he indicated, her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect. He turned then, and she saw his face properly for the first time. He was handsome in a severe way, with sharp features and gray eyes that seemed to see too much. There was no softness in him, no ease. He looked like a man who had long ago decided that control was the only defense against chaos. "How is Catherine?" he asked, moving to sit behind the large desk that dominated the room. "She is intelligent and diligent," Lydia replied carefully. "Her French is adequate. Her mathematics need work. She reads well, but without pleasure. I believe she has been taught to see learning as duty rather than discovery." Something flickered in his eyes. "And you intend to change that, if you permit it, Your Grace. A child who learns only from obligation will never develop the curiosity necessary for true education." He studied her for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching, though her heart beat faster under that scrutiny. Finally, he nodded. "You may proceed as you see fit. I trust you will maintain appropriate discipline." "Of course, Your Grace. Catherine has suffered a great deal. I would not have her suffer more through neglect or harshness." "I understand." He dismissed her then, but as she reached the door, he spoke again. "Miss Marsh," she turned, "you come with excellent references. I expect you to justify them. I will do my best, Your Grace." She left the room with the distinct impression that she had been tested and had passed, but only just. She also left with the uncomfortable awareness that the Duke of Wetherby was not a man who could be easily read or easily pleased. He would be watching. She would have to be perfect. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. Lydia rose early, took her breakfast in the small room set aside for upper servants, and spent her mornings in the schoolroom with Catherine. The girl began slowly to soften. Lydia introduced games into their lessons, used stories to teach history, took Catherine outside to observe the natural world and draw what they saw. The child's solemn face began to show traces of something that might, in time, become happiness. Lydia saw the Duke rarely. He kept to his study, or rode out early to inspect the estate, or traveled to London on political business. When they did encounter each other in the corridors, he acknowledged her with a brief nod. Nothing more. She was relieved. Distance was safety, but she was aware, always, of being observed. Not by the Duke directly, but but by the household. The servants watched her with the careful neutrality of those who had learned not to form attachments too quickly. Mrs. Bellamy watched her with something closer to suspicion. Lydia understood. A governess occupied a strange position, too educated to be dismissed as mere staff, too dependent to be treated as family. She was useful, but she was also expendable. She kept her head down and did her work and spoke to no one unless spoken to first. It was in the library that everything began to shift, though she did not recognize it at the time. She had gone there one afternoon to find a book on natural history for Catherine. The Duke was not present, or so she thought. She was reaching for a volume on the upper shelf when she heard voices from the far corner of the room. Hidden by the tall shelves, she froze. The child is too sensitive. The voice belonged to a man she did not recognize, older, pompous. She needs a firmer hand. This current governess is too soft. Mr. Pemberton, you are a tutor of Latin, not a philosopher of education. That was the Duke's voice, cold and cutting. Miss Marsh's methods are producing results. Catherine is learning. That is what matters. But your Grace, a girl must be taught obedience. She must be taught to think. Obedience without understanding is the training of animals, not the education of minds. You will not interfere with Miss Marsh's work. Is that clear? There was a long silence. Then the older man's voice, stiff with offense. Perfectly clear, Your Grace. Lydia stood very still, her hand still raised toward the shelf, her heart pounding. She heard footsteps, the door opening and closing. She waited several minutes before she moved, retrieved the book she needed, and left the library as quietly as she could. That night, lying in her narrow bed, she thought about what she had heard. The Duke had defended her, not to her face, where it might have meant something personal, but in her absence, where it could only mean that he valued her work. It should have been a relief. It should have been nothing more than professional respect. But she could not stop thinking about the controlled anger in his voice when he had said, she must be taught to think, as though it mattered to him. As though Catherine's mind and heart were not just responsibilities, but something he cared about protecting. It was dangerous, she realized, to think of him as anything other than her employer. It was dangerous to imagine that his defense of her had been anything more than pragmatic. She was nothing to him. She must remember that. She must never forget. But the thought had been planted, and once planted, it began, against her will, to grow. December came, and with it the first snow. The house grew colder, despite the fires that burned in every grate. Lydia wore her shawl constantly, even indoors. Catherine caught a chill, and had to remain in bed for several days. Lydia read to her, brought her warm broth, sat beside her until the fever broke. The Duke came once to check on his niece, his face drawn with worry. He said nothing to Lydia, but when he left, she found a note on the schoolroom desk. Thank you for your care. She kept the note, though she knew she should not. She tucked it between the pages of her journal, and told herself it meant nothing. The household began to prepare for the arrival of guests. The Duke was hosting a gathering over the Christmas season, something he rarely did, according to Mrs. Bellamy. His Grace prefers solitude, the housekeeper said with a sniff. But there are obligations. Lady Arabella Crofton will be among the guests. Her father is the Earl of Langford. It is expected that an announcement will be made. Lydia understood immediately. The Duke was to be married. Of course he was. Men of his station did not remain unmarried forever. They needed heirs, alliances, the continuation of their line. Lady Arabella Crofton was no doubt beautiful, accomplished, perfectly suited to be a duchess. Lydia felt a strange tightness in her chest that she refused to name. She saw the Duke more frequently in the days leading up to the guest's arrival. He was often in the corridors, giving instructions, reviewing preparations. Once she encountered him outside the schoolroom. He paused, looked at her as though about to speak, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded and moved on. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where he had been, feeling foolish and angry at herself for feeling anything at all. The guests arrived on a cold, bright morning. Carriages rolled up the drive. Servants rushed to unload trunks. Voices filled the entrance hall. Lydia kept Catherine in the schoolroom, away from the commotion. But she could not help glancing out the window when she heard the laughter of women, the deeper tones of men. She saw Lady Arabella step down from a carriage, tall, elegant, golden-haired, wrapped in furs, beautiful, untouchable. And she saw Viscount Edmund Crane. She did not know his name yet, but she would learn it soon enough. He was handsome in a way that seemed calculated, his smile too easy, his movements too smooth. He said something that made Lady Arabella laugh, and the sound carried up to the schoolroom window. Lydia turned away. That evening, the household was transformed. Candles blazed in every room. Music drifted up from the drawing room. Lydia ate her supper alone in her room and tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. She told herself she was tired. She told herself it did not matter that the Duke was downstairs, surrounded by people of his own class, preparing to announce his engagement to a woman who belonged in his world, in a way Lydia never could. She told herself many things that night. None of them were true. The next morning, she was summoned to breakfast. It was unusual. Governesses did not typically dine with the family and their guests, but Mrs. Bellamy delivered the instruction with her usual impassive expression. The Duke wishes Miss Catherine to be present at breakfast. You will accompany her. 8 o'clock. Lydia dressed with care, choosing her best gray dress, pinning her hair back with extra precision. Catherine was nervous, clutching Lydia's hand as they descended the stairs. Will there be many people? The girl whispered. Yes, but you will be fine. Just remember your manners and speak only when spoken to. They entered the dining room together. It was a large, formal space, all dark wood and silver, the morning light filtering through tall windows that overlooked the gardens. The long table was set with white linen and gleaming china. Several people were already seated. Lady Arabella sat near the head of the table, composed and lovely in a morning dress of pale blue. Beside her sat an older woman who must have been her mother. Across from them sat Viscount Crane, and beside him 2 other gentlemen Lydia did not recognize. And at the head of the table sat the Duke. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. Catherine, Miss Marsh, please sit. A footman indicated chairs near the far end of the table. Lydia guided Catherine to her seat, and then took her own, acutely aware of every eye upon them. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands folded in her lap. Catherine sat very still beside her, her small face pale. Breakfast was served. The conversation was light, meandering, talk of London, of the weather, of mutual acquaintances. Lydia said nothing. She was not expected to. She helped Catherine with her plate, made sure the child ate, and tried to be as invisible as possible. But she could feel Viscount Crane's gaze on her. She glanced up once and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Amusement, perhaps, or curiosity. He smiled slightly when their eyes met. She looked away quickly. The conversation turned, as it often did in such gatherings, to the education of children. Lady Arabella's mother, the Countess, had opinions. I do believe that girls require a lighter hand than boys. Too much learning makes them unsuitable for their proper roles. One of the gentlemen laughed. Surely a bit of French and watercolors does no harm. Of course not, but one must be careful. I have heard of governesses who encourage girls to read philosophy. Philosophy, as though a woman's mind were designed for such things. Lydia felt her jaw tighten. She said nothing. It was not her place. But then Viscount Crane spoke, his voice smooth and pleasant. I find it fascinating how much influence a governess can have in a household. They are, after all, entrusted with shaping young minds. One might say they hold a position of considerable power. The table quieted slightly. Lady Arabella glanced at Crane with a small frown. The Duke set down his teacup with careful precision. Crane continued, his smile widening just a fraction. Take Miss Marsh, for example. I understand she has been with the household only a few months, yet already she commands a certain respect. The servants speak highly of her. Even the Duke himself has praised her methods. He turned his gaze directly on Lydia. Tell me, Miss Marsh, do you find your position here satisfying? It was a trap. She knew it immediately. If she said yes, she would seem presumptuous. If she said no, she would seem ungrateful. She kept her voice steady and low. I am honored to serve His Grace and to teach Miss Catherine. It is a privilege. A privilege, Crane repeated, as though tasting the word. How charming. And do you find the Duke appreciative of your efforts? The silence that followed was thick and cold. Lydia felt her face flush. She did not know how to answer. She did not know what he wanted her to say. And then the Duke spoke. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth, each word enunciated with brutal clarity. Miss Marsh performs her duties adequately. Beyond that, she is nothing to me. The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Lydia felt them hit, felt the impact reverberate through her chest. She did not look up. She did not move. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened until her knuckles went white. But her face remained perfectly composed. Lady Arabella smiled faintly, a small, satisfied curve of her lips. The Countess nodded approvingly. Viscount Crane inclined his head, his eyes glittering with something that might have been triumph. Catherine beside her had gone very still. Lydia could feel the child's confusion, her distress. She reached under the table and took Catherine's small hand, squeezing it gently. A reassurance. It is all right. I am all right. But she was not all right. A few minutes later, she excused herself quietly, murmuring something about Catherine's lessons. No one objected. No one looked at her. She rose, guided Catherine from the room, and walked with measured steps down the corridor, up the stairs, to the safety of the schoolroom. Only when the door was closed behind them did she allow herself to breathe. She moved to the window and stood there, staring out at the gray sky, her arms wrapped around herself. Catherine hovered nearby, uncertain. Miss Marsh, are you well? Lydia turned and summoned a smile. It felt like lifting a great weight. I am perfectly well, Catherine. Shall we begin our lessons? They worked through the morning. Lydia taught with her usual care, her usual patience. But inside, something had fractured. She had known her place. She had always known it. But to hear it spoken aloud, in front of others, by the man whose respect she had come to value, to be reduced to nothing, publicly, deliberately, it was a humiliation she had not anticipated, and did not know how to bear. That night, alone in her room, she did not weep. She simply stood by the window, and looked out at the dark gardens, and understood, with a clarity that felt like ice, that she had been a fool. She had allowed herself to imagine that his defense of her, in the library, had meant something. She had allowed herself to believe that the note of thanks had been more than courtesy. She had allowed herself, in the quiet privacy of her own heart, to hope. And now she knew. She was nothing to him. He had said so, in front of witnesses, in a voice that left no room for doubt. She would not make that mistake again. In the days that followed, Lydia became a model of perfect distance. She performed her duties without fault. She taught Catherine, managed the schoolroom, kept to her routines. But she avoided all unnecessary interaction with the Duke or his guests. She took her meals in her room. She walked in the gardens only when she knew the household was occupied elsewhere. She made herself, as much as possible, invisible. Adrian noticed. Of course he noticed. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself that his words at breakfast had been necessary, that they had protected her from Crane's insinuations, that by denying any particular regard for her, he had shielded her from the scrutiny and gossip that could destroy a woman in her position. He told himself these things, but the coldness between them unsettled him in ways he could not name. He found himself looking for her in the corridors, listening for her voice in the schoolroom as he passed. He found himself remembering the way she had looked at him in the library weeks ago, when she had not known he was there, her face open, unguarded, intelligent. He found himself regretting the harshness of his words, even as he knew they had been necessary. He did not understand why it mattered. She was his niece's governess. She was competent, respectable, unremarkable. She was, as he had said, nothing to him. But the lie tasted bitter every time he repeated it to himself. Viscount Crane, meanwhile, grew bolder. He had come to Wetherby Hall, ostensibly to enjoy the Duke's hospitality, and to further his acquaintance with Lady Arabella. But Adrian had known Crane for years, and he knew the man's nature. Charming on the surface, cruel beneath. Crane enjoyed games of power and humiliation. He enjoyed finding weaknesses and exploiting them. And he had clearly decided that Lydia Marsh was a weakness. Adrian saw it in the way Crane watched her during the few times she appeared in company. He saw it in the small, knowing smiles Crane exchanged with the other guests when Lydia's name was mentioned. He saw it and it made his jaw tighten with an anger he could not justify and did not want to examine. One afternoon, Adrian was in his study when he heard voices in the corridor outside. He recognized Crane's smooth tones. After a moment, Lydia's quieter voice responding. He moved to the door and opened it slightly. Crane was standing too close to her, his posture casual but invasive. Lydia had taken a small step back, her hands clasped in front of her, her face carefully blank. "I merely wished to inquire," Crane was saying, "whether you might have recommendations for a governess for my own estate. I have been most impressed by your work here. I am afraid I have no recommendations to offer, my lord. If you will excuse me, of course. But tell me, Miss Marsh, do you find the Duke a generous employer? I ask only because I would wish to offer similar terms to any governess I might engage. His Grace is entirely fair, my lord. Now if you will excuse me, I have lessons to prepare." She moved to step past him, but Crane shifted slightly, blocking her path. "You are very dedicated, Miss Marsh. One might almost think you had a personal interest in remaining here." Adrian felt his hand tighten on the door handle. He was about to step into the corridor when Lydia spoke again, her voice cold and clear. "My interest, Lord Crane, is in fulfilling my duties and maintaining my professional reputation. I trust you understand the importance of such things." It was a rebuke, politely delivered but unmistakable. Crane's smile faltered for just a moment. Then he stepped aside. "Of course, forgive me for detaining you." Lydia walked away without another word. Crane watched her go, his expression thoughtful. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction. Adrian closed the door to his study and stood there, his heart beating faster than it should. She had handled Crane perfectly. She had been firm without being insubordinate, clear without being rude. She had defended herself with nothing but words and dignity. And he realized, with a jolt that felt almost physical, that he admired her. Not just her competence, not just her care for Catherine, but her, the woman herself, her intelligence, her quiet strength, the way she navigated a world that gave her no power and demanded everything from her. He realized it, and the realization terrified him. Because if he admired her, if he respected her, if he felt anything for her beyond the distant regard of an employer, then he had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And if anyone else realized it, if Crane or Lady Arabella or any of the guests suspected it, that Lydia would be ruined. She would be dismissed without references, her name destroyed, her future obliterated. He had spoken harshly at breakfast to protect her, but now he understood that the danger was not just from others. It was from himself, from what he felt when he saw her, from what he wanted when he should want nothing. He returned to his desk and tried to focus on the correspondence in front of him. But the words blurred. All he could see was Lydia's face, composed and distant, as she had walked away from Crane. All he could hear was his own voice, cold and final. "She is nothing to me." It had been a lie. He had known it even as he spoke, but he had not realized, until this moment, how much of a lie it was, or how much it would cost him to maintain it. That evening, Lydia was in the garden. It was late, the sun already setting, the air cold enough that her breath misted in front of her. She had not meant to stay out so long, but the house felt stifling, full of voices and expectations, and the constant weight of being watched. Out here, in the fading light, she could breathe. She was standing near the hedge maze, looking out over the frost-covered lawn, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Viscount Crane approaching, his expression pleasant, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Marsh, I did not expect to find anyone out here at this hour." She inclined her head politely. "I was just returning inside, my lord. A moment, if you please. I feel I owe you an apology for this afternoon. I did not mean to make you uncomfortable." "There is no need for an apology, my lord. I was not uncomfortable." He smiled a slow, knowing smile that made her skin prickle. "You are very composed, Miss Marsh. One might almost think you had nothing to hide." She met his gaze steadily. "I have nothing to hide, my lord. Of course not." And yet, the Duke's denial at breakfast was rather vehement, was it not? One might wonder why he felt the need to speak so harshly. Unless, of course, he was hiding something himself. Lydia felt her heart begin to beat faster, but she kept her voice even. "I cannot speak to His Grace's reasons, my lord. I can only assure you that I am here to teach Miss Catherine, and nothing more. Oh, I believe you, Miss Marsh. I do. But I wonder if the Duke believes it, or if he wishes he could. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath. You see, Miss Marsh, a man does not speak so harshly about a woman unless he is trying very hard to convince himself of something. And that makes you interesting and vulnerable. She took a step back, her hands clenched at her sides. I must return inside, my lord. Good evening. She turned and walked away, her stride quick but controlled. She did not run. She did not let him see how his words had shaken her. But her hands were trembling by the time she reached the side door and slipped inside. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Crane had said. A man does not speak so harshly unless he is hiding something. Was it true? Had the Duke's denial been not indifference, but fear? Had he been protecting her, or protecting himself? And if it was fear, if he felt something for her that he could not acknowledge, did that make it better or worse? She did not know. She only knew that the knowledge did not comfort her. It did not ease the humiliation of that morning. It only deepened the wound, because if he cared for her and still denied her, then what did that say about the value he placed on her? What did that say about the kind of love he was capable of? She decided, quietly and finally, that she would seek another position after the season ended. She would write to the agency that had placed her here. She would find somewhere else to go, somewhere far from Wetherby Hall and the Duke and the impossible, unbearable weight of being nothing to the one person whose regard had come to mean everything. She would not remain where love, if it even existed, had to hide behind denial. She would not be the secret shame of a man too afraid to claim her. She deserved more than that. Even if the world would never give it to her, she would not settle for less. The formal evening gathering took place 3 days later. It was a grand affair, the drawing room filled with music and laughter, the guests dressed in their finest. Lydia was present only to supervise Catherine's brief appearance before bedtime. The child had been allowed to come down for half an hour to be seen and admired, and then sent back upstairs. Lydia stood at the edge of the room, near the doorway, her gray dress plain among the silks and satins, her role clear to everyone present. Catherine performed beautifully, curtsying to the guests, answering questions in her soft, careful voice. Lady Arabella smiled at her with distant approval. The Duke watched his niece with something that might have been pride. After the allotted time, Lydia guided Catherine from the room, intending to take her upstairs and then retire to her own room for the night. But as they reached the corridor, Catherine tugged on her hand. "May I have a glass of water, Miss Marsh? I am very thirsty, of course. Wait here." Lydia returned to the drawing room, intending to request a glass from one of the servants. But as she entered, she heard Viscount Crane's voice, louder than before, carrying across the room. He was standing near the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand, his face flushed with drink and amusement. "I tell you, Pemberton, there is something delightfully ironic about the situation. The Duke keeps a governess who is far too pretty and far too clever, and then denies any interest in her with such force that one can only assume he protests too much." Laughter rippled through a small group of men nearby. Adrian, standing across the room in conversation with Lady Arabella's father, went very still. Crane continued, emboldened by his audience. "One wonders what purpose such a woman serves in a household like this. Education certainly, but perhaps other purposes as well. It is not unheard of, after all, for a man of rank to find certain distractions among his staff." The implication was clear. The insult was vile, and it hung in the air like poison. Lydia stood frozen in the doorway, her face burning, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She could not move. She could not breathe. She could only stand there as the room fell silent, and every eye turned toward the Duke. Adrian's face had gone white. His hands, which had been clasped loosely behind his back, were now clenched into fists. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, moving with a controlled fury that made several people step back. He stopped directly in front of Crane, his voice low and deadly. "You will retract that statement now." Crane, surprised but not yet alarmed, smiled. "I merely observed." "You observed nothing. You insulted a woman of irreproachable character. You suggested, in front of witnesses, that she is something other than what she is. You will retract it, or you will meet me for it." The room went utterly silent. Lady Arabella's face had gone pale. Her father stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Your Grace, surely there is no need. There is every need." Adrian's gaze never left Crane's face. "Will you retract, or will you meet me?" Crane's smile faltered. He glanced around the room, perhaps expecting support, perhaps expecting someone to intervene, but no one moved. Finally, he set down his glass and inclined his head. "Very well, Your Grace. If you insist. Dawn, the clearing beyond the east woods. I trust you will bring a second." "I will." Adrian turned and walked from the room without another word. The guests stood in stunned silence. Lydia, still frozen in the doorway, felt the world tilt beneath her. This was not protection. This was exposure. This was the worst thing that could have happened. She turned and fled. She found Catherine still waiting in the corridor, confused and worried. Lydia took her hand, led her upstairs, got her ready for bed, and sat with her until the child fell asleep. Then she returned to her own room and paced the small space like a caged animal. A duel. He had challenged Crane to a duel. Over her. Over words spoken about her. The entire household would know by morning. The entire county would know by the end of the week. And whether he won or lost, whether he killed Crane or was killed himself, she would be ruined. Her name would be spoken in connection with scandal and violence. No respectable household would ever hire her again. She should have been grateful. She should have been honored that he had defended her. But all she felt was fury. She waited until she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, the sound of the Duke returning to his rooms. Then she left her room and followed the sound, her footsteps quick and silent on the carpet. She found him outside his study, his hand on the door handle, his face drawn and exhausted. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression shifted, surprise, perhaps, or wariness. "Miss Marsh, you should not be here. I will not be the reason you destroy yourself." Her voice was low but fierce, shaking with anger and fear. "I will not be the cause of a duel, of scandal. You are not the cause. Crane is the cause. He spoke of you as though you were." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I will not allow it. You already did." The words came out harder than she intended. "You already allowed it. At breakfast, in front of everyone. You said I was nothing to you." He flinched as though she had struck him. "I said it to keep them from touching you. I said it because if they knew..." He stopped again, his hands clenching at his sides. She waited, her heart pounding, her breath coming fast. If they knew what? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, the mask of ducal composure cracked. His voice, when it came, was raw. "If they knew I loved you, they would destroy you." The words hung in the cold air between them. Lydia felt them land, felt the impact, felt everything she had believed shift and reform into something new and terrible and unbearable. "You love me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, and so you denied me. You reduced me to nothing. You humiliated me in front of your guests. To protect you, to protect yourself." She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. "You were afraid. You are still afraid. And so you would rather hide me, deny me, fight a duel over me in secret, than simply stand beside me and claim me openly. It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple." Her voice broke, but she did not look away. "I do not want a man who fights for me in secret and denies me in public. I do not want a man who loves me only when no one is watching. I want a man who can stand beside me in daylight in front of the world. Or I want none at all." He stared at her, his face stricken. "They would destroy you. Your reputation, your future. My reputation is already destroyed. The moment you challenged Crane, you ensured that. Whether you fight him or not, my name will be connected to scandal. I will be dismissed. I will have no references. I will have nothing." She took a shaking breath. "So if I am to lose everything, let it be for truth. Let it be for something real. Not for a secret. Not for a lie." He reached for her, then stopped, his hand falling to his side. "Lydia." It was the first time he had spoken her name. She closed her eyes against the sound of it. "If you do this," she said quietly, "if you fight this duel, you prove that I am a weakness, that I am something to be defended, not someone to be chosen. And I will not stay. I will not remain in a house where I am loved in shadows and denied in daylight. She turned and walked away before he could respond. She did not look back. She could not. Behind her, Adrian stood in the corridor, his hand still raised as though to call her back, his heart breaking in ways he had not known were possible. Dawn came pale and reluctant, the sky gray with the promise of snow. Adrian dressed in silence, his valet pale with worry, his hands shaking as he helped the Duke into his coat. The duel was set for a clearing beyond the east woods, a place far enough from the house to be discreet, but close enough to reach before full light. Adrian had not slept. He had spent the night in his study, staring at the fire, replaying Lydia's words over and over in his mind. I do not want a man who loves me only when no one is watching. She was right. He knew she was right. He had told himself he was protecting her. But the truth was he had been protecting himself. From scandal, yes. From the loss of political alliances. From the disapproval of his peers. But also from the vulnerability of loving someone openly. Of choosing someone the world would say he should not choose. Of risking everything for a woman who had no title, no fortune, no place in his world. He had been a coward. And his cowardice had wounded her more deeply than Crane's insults ever could. He was pulling on his gloves when he heard footsteps in the entrance hall. He turned, expecting his second, Lord Pemberton, who had reluctantly agreed to accompany him. But it was Lydia. She stood in the entrance hall, cloaked against the cold, her face pale, but resolute. She did not plead. She did not weep. She simply looked at him with those clear, intelligent eyes, and spoke. If you do this, you prove that I am a weakness, that I am something to be defended, not someone to be chosen. He had heard the words before, last night in the corridor. But now, in the gray light of dawn, they struck him with new force. I do not want a man who fights for me in secret and denies me in public, she continued, her voice steady. I want a man who can stand beside me, or none at all. He met her gaze. For the first time in his life, the careful control he had built around himself, the mask of the Duke, the armor of duty and restraint, cracked completely. I thought silence was protection, he said quietly. It was a cage. He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he removed his gloves and set them on the table. He turned to Lord Pemberton, who had just entered the hall. Send word to Crane. The duel is withdrawn. Pemberton's eyes widened. Your Grace, you cannot simply. I can, and I will. Adrian's voice was firm, steady. The duel is withdrawn, not out of cowardice, but because the premise was false. Miss Marsh is not nothing to me, and I will not treat her as such again. He turned back to Lydia. Send word to Crane, he repeated to Pemberton. Tell him that I withdraw the challenge. Tell him that Miss Marsh is under my protection, and that any man who speaks of her with disrespect will answer to me, not in secret, not at dawn, but openly and before witnesses. Pemberton stared at him, then nodded slowly. As you wish, Your Grace. He left the hall. Adrian and Lydia stood alone in the pale morning light. The cost will be real, Lydia said quietly. Lady Arabella will leave. Her father will withdraw his support. Your political alliances will fray. Yes, I know. He took a step toward her. But I have spent my life building alliances and maintaining appearances and doing what was expected. And none of it has made me happy. None of it has made me whole. He reached out and took her hand. She did not pull away. I do not know what will come of this, he said. I do not know if society will forgive it, or if we will be cast out, or if we will spend the rest of our lives fighting for a place in a world that does not want us. But I know that I would rather face that with you than face a lifetime of safety without you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. You are certain? I have never been more certain of anything. She nodded once, slowly. Then she stepped closer and rested her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her and held her, there in the entrance hall, as the pale light grew stronger and the household began to stir. By midday, the news had spread. Lady Arabella and her parents departed within hours. The understanding between them dissolved without a word spoken. Viscount Crane left soon after, his expression cold and furious. The other guests followed over the next few days, murmuring polite excuses, but making their disapproval clear. Adrian did not flinch. He did not apologize. He simply went about his days as he always had, with one difference. Lydia was no longer hidden. She was no longer invisible. She walked beside him in the corridors, sat with him in the library, dined with him and Catherine in the smaller, quieter dining room that had once been reserved for family alone. The cost was real. Invitations were quietly rescinded. Political allies grew distant. Letters arrived from London, some expressing shock, others expressing outright condemnation. Adrian read them all and set them aside without comment. But there were other letters too, from men and women who wrote to say they admired his courage, from families who had always felt the weight of society's expectations and were glad to see someone defy them, from people who believed that love, real love, was worth more than appearances. And slowly, quietly, a new kind of respect began to grow. Not the respect of power, but the respect of principle. Weeks later, on a morning much like the one when everything had changed, Lydia entered the dining room and paused. The table was smaller now, set for only 3. Catherine sat in her usual place, chattering happily about a book she was reading. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, soft and pale. Adrian stood by the table, waiting. When Lydia entered, he crossed the room without hurry. He moved her chair, the one at the far end of the table where she had always sat, and placed it beside his own. No words were spoken, but the gesture said everything. The servants noticed. Mrs. Bellamy, standing near the door, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The footman who poured the tea did so with a respect that had not been there before. Lydia looked up at Adrian, searching his face. He met her gaze steadily, his gray eyes clear and unguarded. "I will not hide you again," he said quietly. She did not lower her eyes. She nodded once and took her seat beside him. They sat together. The tea was poured. Catherine asked a question about her lessons, and Lydia answered with a smile. Outside, the season was turning. The snow had melted. The first green shoots were beginning to appear in the gardens. And in that quiet room, love was no longer a secret. It was a choice, witnessed and claimed. The months that followed were not easy. There was no fairy tale erasure of consequence. Some in society turned away. Others watched with cautious curiosity. Lydia was no longer a governess, but neither was she yet fully recognized as Adrian's equal in the eyes of the world. She did not mind. She had learned, through pain and humiliation, and finally through truth, that dignity was not granted by title. It was claimed by living honestly, by refusing to hide, by standing in the light, even when the light was harsh. Adrian, for his part, discovered that love was not a weakness to be managed. It was a strength that demanded honesty, courage, and the willingness to risk everything for what mattered most. One evening in early winter, they walked together along the terrace. The sky was vast and open, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. The air was cold enough to sting, but neither of them minded. He took her hand, not furtively, not hidden in the folds of her skirt, but openly, his fingers lacing through hers. She shivered slightly, and he drew her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. They stood there for a long moment, looking out at the darkening landscape. "I was afraid," he admitted quietly. "So was I," she replied. He turned to face her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I am not afraid anymore. Neither am I." He kissed her then. It was not hurried or furtive or hidden. It was deliberate, full, and free of shame. She leaned into him, her hands resting against his chest, and kissed him back with all the longing and relief and love she had kept locked inside for so long. When they finally parted, her breath misted in the cold air. He touched her face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Will you marry me?" he asked. She smiled, the first truly unguarded smile he had ever seen from her. Yes. They stood together in the twilight, the world vast and cold around them, but between them only warmth. Later, they returned indoors. The fire was lit in the drawing room. The door closed softly behind them. What occurred in the privacy of that room was theirs alone, words spoken in low voices, promises made and sealed, the slow, careful exploration of two people who had finally found the courage to claim each other fully. When morning came, they emerged not as Duke and former Governess, but as two people who had chosen one another, fully and without apology. Spring arrived tentative and tender. The gardens at Wetherby Hall, coming back to life after the long winter. The wedding was small, attended by those who understood that love was not spectacle, but substance. Catherine stood beside Lydia, holding a small bouquet of early flowers, her solemn face bright with happiness. A few friends from the county came, and a handful of Adrian's political allies, who had decided that principle mattered more than appearance. Lady Arabella did not attend. Viscount Crane had left the county entirely. The Countess of Langford sent no acknowledgement. Lydia did not care. She stood beside Adrian in the small chapel on the estate, wearing a simple dress of pale blue, her hand in his, and spoke her vows with a steady voice. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian kissed her in front of everyone, and she kissed him back, and the small gathering applauded. They held a quiet celebration afterward, tea and cake in the drawing room, conversation that was easy and warm. Catherine laughed, a sound Lydia had rarely heard from her, and Adrian smiled, the hard lines of his face softening in a way they never had before. As the sun set and the guests departed, Lydia and Adrian walked through the gardens together. The air smelled of earth and new growth. The sky was streaked with pink and gold. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. The cost. She looked at him. This man who had denied her, and then claimed her, who had been afraid, and then brave, who had chosen her when the world told him not to. "No," she said, "I regret nothing." He took her hand and raised it to his lips. "Neither do I." They returned to the house as the stars began to appear. The door closed behind them. The world outside continued, its judgments, its hierarchies, its cruelties. But inside, in the warmth of Wetherby Hall, there was something the world could not touch. A year passed, then another. Lydia established a small school for the children of tenants and tradespeople, teaching them reading and mathematics, and the skills they would need to make their way in the world. Adrian supported her quietly, with resources and respect, and slowly the school became known throughout the county as a place where children of any background could learn. Adrian's political influence had diminished, but his moral authority had grown. He was consulted now not for power, but for principle. Men and women who had once dismissed him as foolish for marrying a governess began to seek his counsel on matters of justice and fairness. Catherine grew into a bright, confident young woman, no longer the solemn, wounded child Lydia had first met. She spoke of becoming a teacher herself one day, of carrying on the work Lydia had started. One afternoon in late spring, Lydia and Adrian returned.